Okay, well, welcome to week 3. This is a consideration of the question, what is postmodernism? What is postmodernism? You may have noticed in the class that we kind of dove into late modern or postmodern thought almost immediately with Stan Wallace's article, bringing around some definition around a couple of key concepts within postmodernism to help us to locate exactly what we were talking about in a more concrete way. That's obviously by design. The whole conversation about postmodern versus modern and so on is a very uh, complicated and huge set of conversation points, actually, regarding philosophy generally and its development and evolution down through the ages, particularly 16, 17, 1800s in Western Europe, and how that spilled with the settling of the colonies in America into the Americas, and how that's affected and evolved even from that point into, again, what we call a late modern or postmodern mindset. And, there's a lot to know, obviously. In the PowerPoints uh, assigned for this week, we'll do kind of a brief survey from Thomas Aquinas and his thought process about the fall and its lack of touching human intellect. That is to say, his conviction that human intellect is not fallen. Trace that error in his theology through various huge and important philosophical uh, waves or eras or epochs or movements that swept through in an overlapping way Western culture in the post-Middle Ages, meaning from around 12, 13, 1400 on forward. The Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, was a huge part of the societal and cultural changes that were taking place in Western Europe in the latter hundreds of years that followed the Dark Ages and the Black Plague and all that it left in its wake. But all that to say that postmodernism, late modernism, is something that is very present with us. It's very observable if you know what you're looking for. It is really the predominant thought form cluster of our times. And I've pointed to a few threads, the 4 threads as I call them: pop music, film, pop culture in general, art, as a way to kind of put your finger on what these ideas look like in real life, at least in real creative life. This week I want to point you toward a clip from the Talking Heads. It's a great group from the 80s. David Byrne and the Talking Heads were groundbreaking in many, many ways. They really set the stage for a lot of bands that would come both within kind of formal punk rock genre circles to all kinds of various expressions on the theme of punk rock and punk style rock, even Nirvana and Kurt Cobain, who we'll talk about shortly, in the grunge rock movement. That was a different kind of an expression musically of rock and roll in the late 80s, took their cue from David Byrne and the Talking Heads, and specifically there's a song that I'm pointing to in that album, which was made into a film by Jonathan Demme, who's a famous, really accomplished director, called Stop Making Sense. That's the title of the film. The album included the song that you saw, which is basically called Once in a Lifetime. And, we don't have the time to do a full analysis here, but if you just pay close attention to the style in which that film was shot, there's a few things that jump out at you immediately. David Byrne's voice, his delivery, his sort of staccato kind of physicality, the suit that he's wearing, which is drawn from Japanese theater. There's a huge tradition behind it. But that suit progressively through the film gets bigger and bigger and sort of eats him alive as a modern person. Once in a lifetime, the song, you may ask yourself, da 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 da, is really, the lyric is really searching to express the moment in time when a modern person stops and asks themselves the key question: what does my life really mean? How did I get here? Where are we now? How did all these things become a part of my existence? Sort of a philosophical, deeply philosophical song. The title, Stop Making Sense, really is a very postmodern or late modern exclamation, because it's really speaking to the mindset of the modernist who wants to make sense of everything, wants to have a narrative for everything. In many ways, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you think about it, the Christian worldview is a narrative-based, sense-making paradigm. When we come into a relationship with Christ, the disparate elements of our life are intended to come together and make a kind of sense. And the postmodern person doesn't see life that way. They don't see that life makes sense inherently, and that there's a truth out there beyond their own truth that can bring definition to whatever their own truth is. They reject those ideas. And we've talked about that. But I want to point you towards that song and David Byrne and that group as one more of many expressions of pop music that's really delving into the emotions and the feelings and the questions behind the late modern person's dilemma. One of the ways that Stan Wallace encourages us not to think about postmodernism is in a historical, chronological sense. Although, while that's an excellent point of view, I think it's just natural for us to think of post or late modernism in terms of the modern era through which many of us lived. When I was in high school, for instance, in 1981 and graduating, the internet didn't exist. I know, I'm getting old. Cell phones didn't exist. A lot of things that we take for granted today didn't exist. We were coming out of the 60s and the 70s, obviously, rocketing out of a time of great turmoil and social change in such a way that the old thought forms were breaking down. My favorite example of a modernist person, to bring definition to what is a modern person then? If we're talking about postmodern, then what is modern, which came before postmodern, right? My favorite example of a modern person is Thomas Jefferson. If you think about it, Thomas Jefferson was one of the founding fathers of the country, author of the Declaration of Independence, tremendous intellect, philosopher, scientist, botanist, politician, diplomat, just a Renaissance man, someone who believed that the human race could improve themselves through learning and growth and hard work into the best version of a human being that has ever existed. Again, he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, which we take as our founding document, and every free and democratic country that's ever come from or after the United States looks to that declaration as their own declaration of the value and inherent dignity and worth of human individual life. And that's a great thing, except when you recognize that Thomas Jefferson was also a lifelong committed slaveholder. And he owned 200 people. And when he died, he didn't even put into his will that he should free those people, including his mistress, Sally Hemings, who he had a number of children with. They were all left in slavery to support his, wealthy landowning lifestyle. When a postmodern or late modern person looks at Thomas Jefferson, they see contradictions that can't be held together. They look at idealistic, kind of lofty language of the Declaration of Independence and say, yes, human freedom is what it's all about, and yet this guy was a terrible slave owner who owned human beings for their entire lives. Now, he ostensibly treated them reasonably well in that condition and context, but even so, it's just a ridiculous notion that someone with such a high level commitment to freedom could live in a way that was so contradictory to their belief system. So when a postmodern thinks about modern thought, they generally think in those terms. There's contradictions, there's gaps, there's holes in the narrative that don't make sense. Stop making sense, right? Stop even trying to persuade us that life can be made sense of in the ways that you want to suggest it. And I'm not suggesting in this class, by the way, nor Stan Wallace or others, that all of postmodern thought is negative or detrimental. It certainly isn't. There are many streams of the thought process and thought form of postmodernism that are quite helpful. The deconstructionism, the question asking, the questioning of authority. These things can be likened to deep Christian convictions about the use of power and information and knowledge and human government and so on. And so don't understand that I'm an anti-late modern or postmodern thinker, but what we do have to understand is that there are key elements that define postmodernism that are very much contradictory, antithetical to the Christian worldview, as Wallace's article suggests. So in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about this week. We're really trying to get into the modern, postmodern quagmire of thought process. How is it that we've arrived out of the modern era? What has caused that to take place? And where does that leave us? I think it's really important, too, to think about, and we'll point to examples later in the class, the reality that the terminology post or late modern, postmodern in particular, is an artistic term. It comes from the art world first. That Pablo Picasso and Vincent van Gogh and others were considered to be revolutionary and groundbreaking artists of the early and middle 20th century in such a way that they mastered, Pablo Picasso in particular, just about every expression of the visual arts and rendered their own work, in those terms to the degree that they were considered to be geniuses. But then along comes others who broke all those forms, who rejected all those forms, people like Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko or Andy Warhol, other later postmodern expressionists, abstract expressionists, minimalists, and so on, who just took the art forms of the modern era and turned them on their head. So the concept, the idea of modern, postmodern, those terminologies are really rooted first and foremost in the visual arts, and then they become employed by philosophical minds and philosophers to describe the bigger currents that are mirrored in the trends of art, but are more gritty and down to earth and everyday in their application, and have penetrated all the different forms of the culture, pop culture included. So all the different creative art forms are now expressing late modern and postmodern ideas and concepts and exploring those. Well, I hope that this week provides you with all that you need to really begin to get your teeth into what it means to get a handle, at least, on modernism and then what's flowed from it in this post and late modern sensibility set. And that as we move forward, and we also move backward into the history of philosophy itself and the longer term evolution, that you'll have a sense of placement. That's really the goal here. That we're not just here in the most recent time in the 21st century considering our thought forms, but we're recognizing that our thought forms today come from somewhere. They've evolved down through the ages from many lives and many generations lived before us that have worked through issues, and sometimes worked through those issues very well, and sometimes have gone off on various explorations that produce all kinds of interesting observation, but can sometimes muddy or confuse the situation. So I hope that again you're getting a sense of clarity emerging about what this postmodern, late modern thing is and where it's placed in the history of the West in particular and humankind in general. All right. We'll see you next week.